Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined by silent co-host Ludwig von B. And I thought I'd just talk to you a little bit today about something musical that came into my thoughts. I recently rewatched the movie Yesterday. For those who don't know, Yesterday is a 2019 film about a struggling singer-songwriter who, after falling unconscious in this weird electrical storm, wakes up to find he is the only person alive who knows who the Beatles are. His Beatle albums are mysteriously missing from his record collection. The Beatles don't exist on Google. And when he plays Yesterday on his own guitar for some friends, they act like he's written a beautiful new song and isn't just playing the most covered Beatles song of all time. So maybe you've heard bad things about the movie Yesterday. And on the one hand, I concede that the film has two major flaws. One flaw is that it's sort of based around a love story. And that love story itself is kind of corny, it is hackneyed pacing. The other problem with the film is that it doesn't take itself too seriously as a science fiction thought experiment. So if the Beatles never existed, it would, of course, have a chain reaction of effects. The likelihood that a contemporary person would even have a massive record collection if the Beatles never existed is questionable, given that the Beatles popularized the idea that albums were more than packaging. The art of designing an album and putting songs together was inseparable from the art of being a musician. That's an idea the Beatles are largely associated with. So, yeah, there are these two problems with Yesterday in terms of it not doing very much with its thought experiment and the love story element not being that great. But while I would concede these are fair criticisms, they aren't the kind of criticisms that get to the fundamental question of, is Yesterday a good movie? Because for me, Yesterday is a good movie. Let's say 8 out of 10. And why is it a good movie? Well, the drama is well paced. It's visually enticing. It has some good comedic moments. It pays nice tribute to the Beatles, the reason you're seeing the movie. And it does make the fairly smart decision of taking a nuanced approach to whether a person who covered the Beatles would be a successful musician or not. The protagonist, Jack Malek, while he does ultimately find incredible fame, he stumbles a bit at first because the songs of the Beatles, while great pieces of songwriting, they aren't uniquely brilliant. It's totally possible that had they been written by some schmuck at an open mic, all they'd get was nice applause. So why then did Yesterday get kind of mixed reviews? Well, there's a certain type of critic who I think goes into a movie using a rubric. For those who don't know this word, like this checklist for grading, for evaluating. And they'll say, X was bad about the movie, therefore the movie gets a bad grade. And what I would want to tell those critics is put their rubrics away. Just ask the simple question, did you enjoy the movie? If Yesterday lacked other positive traits and it really was about its mediocre romance subplot, then I would agree the poor quality of the romance writing should be held against the movie. But seeing as the romance doesn't overpower the greater story about being a musician rediscovering the songs of the Beatles, I would treat it as a minor flaw that should be criticized but doesn't really factor into your grade of the film. So anyway, why am I talking about this movie from 2019 and why I have the sense that I like it more than other film buffs? Well, a while ago, I posted a critique of another Beatles jukebox musical movie, that movie being Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And recently, I watched yet another Beatles jukebox musical movie, Across the Universe. And so watching these three movies made me ask the question, what would make a Beatles jukebox musical good? Or rather, how does one get the most out of the concept? If some Hollywood studio executive were to decide to make yet another one, and I certainly wouldn't put it past them, they love their remakes these days, what would make it a genuinely good movie? Well, in thinking about my perspective about this, what I would say is I like Yesterday, and I don't really like those other two movies. And I think it's pretty easy to explain why. Yesterday is first and foremost a story. The other two films have stories, but those stories are clearly cobbled together around the songs. So, as I mentioned in my Sgt. Pepper's review, while that film does have some fun and charmingly corny psychedelic visuals, its storytelling is instantly curtailed by the fact that it refuses to let virtually any of its characters talk. Pretty much all of the dialogue in that movie is the songs. And needless to say, that does not make for a very coherent narrative. Across the Universe actually does have talking, but it's still clear that that talking is built along the songs. To talk a bit about the substance of Across the Universe, one of its main characters is Lucy. Lucy is named for the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And she's this all American girl with a boyfriend in the army. Thus, before he goes off to the war, she gets to dance with him and sing, Hold Me Tight. Then he dies, and she gets to sing, Let It Be, Let It Be. Then there's this rushed homage to 60s culture, and she becomes an anti Vietnam War protester. But the moment she sees some of her comrades using violent tactics, she denounces them right away. There's also this brief non sequitur of a reference to a racist police killing, which also gets thrown into the Let It Be sequence. And Bono shows up at some point to be Dr. Robert, the subject of one of the lesser Beatles songs, and sing the song I Am a Walrus. Why? Because he's a weird psychedelic guy, so he gets to sing the weird psychedelic song. As you can see, Across the Universe is basically just a pastiche of 60s tropes, and that alone does not make for a good movie. Don't get me wrong, I love the 60s. I love 60s tropes, but you actually have to have a good story. You can't just do the tropes and say, you like the 1960s, therefore you like this movie. Another way of comparing these movies is looking at the songs that are in all of them. And I tried creating a little chart here. So I put the songs that are just in Yesterday in yellow, the songs just in Sergeant Pepper's in red, the songs just in Across the Universe in blue, and then I used mixed colors for songs that are shared between them. You will see that there are only 16 songs approximately. I didn't find a master list. I just had to sort of cobble this together. But 16 songs in Yesterday, 27 songs in Sergeant Pepper's, and 33 songs in Across the Universe. So which ones do you think are just trying to jam in as much Beatles stuff as possible, being like, yeah, we're the most Beatlesy there, we're good. And which one says, okay, to have a good story, you actually have to cut some things and prioritize which songs are going to be in there. But beyond that, what you notice is that the songs that are distinct to Yesterday are real Beatles A-listers. They might not be about the most distinct subject matter. They might be poppier songs rather than interesting songs. But that means when people hear these songs, they're genuinely happy to hear those particular songs. Whereas with Sergeant Pepper's and Across the Universe, not only is the song choice less fun, but they clearly were desperate to find songs that themselves would advance the plot. They go with songs like Dear Prudence or Happiness is a Warm Gun or Mean Mr. Mustard or You Never Leave Me My Money. And the problem with this choice is, again, these songs might be a bit more helpful for storytelling than, vague things like Yesterday or I Want to Hold Your Hand, but they don't help that much. And, while I like Dear Prudence and Happiness is a Warm Gun somewhat, they aren't nearly the bops that those simpler early Beatles pop classics are and don't really contain specific storytelling moments. So it's just this pointless ambition that takes both Sergeant Pepper's and Across the Universe nowhere. There's another problem of trying to derive story directly from songs, and namely the appeal of music, certainly rock and pop music, isn't strictly the songs. No, it's the sort of interaction of the songs with the artist who sings them. Think about it. When you buy an album, which is to a musician what the novel or short story collection is to the author, when you buy this album, oftentimes it'll have a picture of the musician on the front. This is different than buying an author's book. The author's book might have a picture of the author in small inside the jacket or on the back. But with an album, the artist is not just the storyteller, the artist is directly or indirectly the protagonist. So when one listens to music, one is not listening to the songs in isolation of the artist. What lends the song some of its enjoyability is having a sense of the personality who's singing it. So actually take the various short songs from the end of the Abbey Road album that for some reason Across the Universe and Sergeant Pepper's are so obsessed with. On their own, these are short, underwritten, kind of interesting, but mostly forgettable songs. What makes them kind of enjoyable is knowing who's singing them. If you listen to an album like Abbey Road, you get, great song after great song in the first half, and then you get these short little weird songs, but they're from these four musicians who you've been following for years. And to just hear John Lennon goofing around with, did you see Polythene Pam? Having been so devoted to John Lennon first as, idol, crush to all these screaming fans, and listening in hindsight, knowing that this goofy John Lennon would go on to become John Lennon, the protest singer, it just adds all these dimensions to the song that are not literally there in the song itself. So, as I mentioned, one of the key scenes in Across the Universe that tries to be profound and speak to racial political issues is Let It Be, which is sung both by the main character, Lucy, mourning the death of her soldier boyfriend, and also at this dramatic African American funeral, mourning the killing of a boy in Detroit by the police. And the sense in this scene is that, like, Let It Be is like the greatest gospel song ever written, that it speaks to all the pain in the world. Let It Be is a solid song, but I mean, it's not a brilliant piece of poetry. None of the lyrics on the page just stand out to you as sheer genius, and they certainly wouldn't if they weren't written by Paul McCartney. But they are written by Paul McCartney. And when one realizes that this reassuring song came to Paul as his band was falling apart, and it was this way of connecting with the mother he lost as a boy, and it ends up being this bittersweet way the band says goodbye. That specific meaning of the song is why it resonates with so people. This bittersweet goodbye to the Beatles, trying to translate it to people mourning racist police killings just feels like a hopeless exaggeration. Whereas enjoying it as this expression of Paul McCartney makes it the great song it actually is. So, what would be my theory for how to make the best possible Beatles jukebox musical? Well, again, I think Yesterday is a good movie, but where I think there's still opportunity to innovate is Yesterday is only sort of about the Beatles, right? You could mostly make a similar movie about another huge artist, a world where Elvis never existed, a world where Michael Jackson never existed, or so on. So I guess the next great Beatles jukebox musical should aspire not just to be about someone who is a fan of the Beatles, but it should aspire to more so be about the Beatles. Now, I don't think the characters should literally be John, Paul, George, and Ringo, because I think that would raise all kinds of questions about what's true, what's not, what autobiography. So I think what they should do is have characters who are loosely based on the ideas of the Beatles. You have the troubled and also goofy one with the potential to become political as the stand-in for John. You have the one who attempts to be the unifier and is into corny love songs based on Paul. You have the quiet working class kid who gradually develops this unique interest in Indian music and spiritualism, George. And you have the quiet, chronically underrated drummer who is half willing to be the silly one and has this fixation on octopuses, Ringo. And what I think you would do is you would sort of find a way to make a dramatic story out of how sort of each one does their craft. I mean, there's models for doing stories of Beatles who are not quite the Beatles, like the Simpsons episode Homer's Barbershop Quartet. And look, I'm not a screenwriter. I'm not telling you what the movie would be, but I think if we did something that was as accessible and as clearly told as Yesterday, but brought in a bit more psychedelic imagining, so it's somewhere on a spectrum between Yesterday and Yellow Submarine. And again, like Yesterday, chooses good songs, not too many, but songs that are genuinely enjoyable. I think that would be the path to making a good Beatles jukebox musical. So let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments below. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.